My, do we have some cool things to talk about today? Hello, everyone. Welcome to After Action Report, your numbers recap show for all Schmut matches to keep you caught up on all the action. I'm your host, Megs, here on the Call to Action podcast channel. Today, on this classified edition, we're going to be doing a breakdown of the singles tournament and all the things that happen round by round. Before I do that, I have got to talk to you guys about a couple things that happened during the rundown this past week, where William Bibiani came on and talked about some of the big rule changes that we're going to see coming into Season 9. Two things in particular really stood out to me as a statistician and about things that I've talked about throughout the past couple of years, and specifically this year doing this show. So the one thing I want to talk about first is the changes to the scoring system. The big change here is that we are now standardizing from the IG and Star Wars division across the singles and teams. So we're now going into more questions in round one. And depending on if you're talking about singles or teams, you either gain or lose a question inside of round two. So thinking about the score high points that I just talked about earlier this year, we're going to get a little bit of a reset this coming year because the potential points and the maximum potential points that are available to a team or a singles competitor is going to change going into this next season. So thinking about what we saw previously in the singles, we had 27 potential points with a maximum possible points of 29. That is now going to be at 31 and 33 respectively with this new scoring system, with it now going to 10 questions in round one plus a potential bonus and 5 questions inside of round two. When we talk about the teams division, we're going from 40 possible points and 42 maximum potential to 42 possible points and a maximum of 44, with going from a potential of 18 to 24 points inside of round one, and then you're going from 12 points down to only 10 points inside of round two. So those are just the basic breakdown of what the scoring system changes are going to look like moving into this next season. It's going to be really exciting to see what kind of changes we see in the division moving forward, particularly with the singles and teams and the league overall. The other big change that we saw is with spinners and opponent's choice. Those two slices, as well as an additional random slice, is going to be under the wild card rule, where they're going to be covered when you initially do your spin, and you can decide to spin off a wild card or gamble and choose one of those cards. Now, the trick is, as we understand it currently, if you elect to take a wild card and it is spinner's choice, you obviously get to choose your slice off the wheel, and previously the card or the slice that you choose is then not available for the next person who spins that wheel. But now, not only is that slice not available, spinner's choice is then off the board. So that is going to change things from things that I talked about earlier in this season with seeing the double spinners and the double opponents choices this year. That's going to go away because while we may be able to get spinners and opponents inside of a match, we will no longer be seeing double spinners or double opponents choices moving into this next season. So those were the two big things that I pulled from this past rundown and the rule changes that we know about so far. Once the official rulebook is released, I'll be able to look through that. And if I find any other really interesting changes or adjustments, I'll be sure and let you guys know. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the singles tournament and find out what kind of big changes we saw in that tournament round by round. So looking at what we saw in the first two rounds, I'm bunching these two together because we actually saw pretty similar numbers across the two rounds. So in order to keep it simple, I went ahead and grouped them all together. Round one was an average of 7 points. Round two averaged closer to 6 points. Accuracy on average was 81%, and the potential points earned on average was 72% across the 24 matches in rounds 1 and 2. If we look at the particulars that we saw during the tournament, we had one instance of a score that was 100% accuracy and 100% potential points earned. That was by Brendan Meyer. There was no 5-pointer involved in this score because his opponent, Adam Collins, did not push him to have to answer his 5-pointer in order to win the match. However, every available point that was afforded to Brendan Meyer, he was able to get. So that is where that comes from. And then Adam Collins also was able to score a 100% accuracy score facing off against Peggy Gubbins. However, he missed out on the 100% potential points earned because he did check down to multiple choice once in that round, but still very impressive. Overall, in round one, we saw 8 perfect round ones, and 5 out of those 8 also included the competitor getting the bonus question. If we look at the matches overall, we saw 3 total matches that were determined via TKO. We saw Collins versus Gubbins in the first round, Merle versus Sloth in the first round, and then Janine the Machine and Eric Zipper in the second round. Also in the second round, we saw 1 match be decided via KO. That was the live match that was between Griffey Nooms and Josh Horowitz. Overall, if you look at the total questions asked versus correct in the matches, we saw 3 total matches that had an accuracy that was above 90%. In round 1, we saw William Bibiani against Jacob London, Griffey Nooms versus Video Drew, and in the second round, Adam Collins versus Brendan Meyer. All 3 of those had accuracies that were above 90%. So when I took a look at these first 2 rounds, I wanted to also compare these numbers to what we were seeing during the pre-tournament season of this year. So all the matches that happened prior to the start of the tournaments, how did those numbers compare to what we are seeing now here in these first 2 rounds of the tournaments? Actually, the numbers were not that different. So round 1 average was about the same. Round 2 average was close to the same. The accuracies and the potential points earned were also very similar. So how in the world did that happen? Because we have 3 out of 24 matches having a match accuracy that was above 90%. And you and I well know that there were a lot of matches that were 100% accuracy, 100% potential points earned across the board during the early season. So let's take a look at what the matches looked like comparing preseason to these first 2 tournaments. So this is where things got interesting, because comparing the first 2 rounds of the tournament and the pre-tournament season matches, you start to see where my confusion was coming from. We knew that there were a ton of matches that had accuracies that was 90% and above. That is the darker gray part of the pie graph inside of that pre-tournament season. And we knew that there was a much smaller percentage of them in the first 2 rounds of the tournament. So we see out of 45 matches in the pre-tournament season, we actually see an even distribution of matches that have 90% and above in that dark gray. The red are matches that had accuracies between 75% and 90%. And then the lighter gray are matches that had match accuracies that were below 75%. So thinking about it that way, everything kind of evened out during the preseason. We had quite a few matches that were above 90%, but we also had quite a few matches that were below 75%, and it all evened out to hit somewhere in the middle. Versus when we look at the first 2 rounds of the tournament, we saw a much higher percentage in that middle range between 75 and 90%. Looks like about 2/3 of that graph is taken up by those matches that had the 75 and 90% accuracy. So while we saw that there were matches that had those really high accuracies, because there was a higher percentage that were between 75 and 90, it evens out to where the pre-tournament season and the tournament round 1 and 2 averaged out to being about the same, but the distribution of the match accuracies is vastly different when you compare pre-tournament season and those first 2 rounds of the tournament. So this was a really cool graphic to pull together because, like I said, I was looking at the average match accuracies and the numbers between pre-tournament season and those first 2 rounds of the tournaments, and they were about the same. And now I see the reason why. I knew in the back of my mind that there were so many matches that had those high accuracies in the preseason, but because we saw a lot of highs, we also saw quite a few lows with those lower, below 75% match accuracies. Versus in the tournament, we saw a much higher percentage of those matches being in that middle ground of between 75 and 90%. So the distribution of the matches were vastly different, but the average ended up being very similar. So let's jump into the quarterfinals of the tournament. So we're looking at 4 matches. Round 1 was about 6 points. Round 2 was closer to 7 points. Average accuracy, 79.8. Potential points earned going to 74.3. So to compare what we saw in the first two rounds of the tournament and what we're seeing now in the quarterfinals, we're seeing that the round one averages actually go down a little bit between rounds 1 and 2 and these quarterfinals. Round 2 actually goes up slightly as far as the average scores, again, between rounds 1 and 2 and these quarterfinals. So when you look at the accuracies, you see that the accuracies come down a little bit when you come into the quarterfinals, and the potential points earned actually goes up a little bit. So that makes sense, actually, when you think about the idea that maybe competitors are missing a few more questions in round 1, but they're going for the full 2 points more often, getting more available points inside of round 2, bringing up their potential points earned accuracy, while they may be sacrificing a little bit of accuracy there in round 1. So going back into the quarterfinal matches, looking at some of the particulars of things that we saw one instance of a perfect round that was by Barbarian, and one perfect round plus the bonus was done by William Bibiani. We saw one match be determined by TKO, that was Griffin Nooms versus Paige for Betty. We saw 3 instances of scores that were above 90%, that was William Bibiani, Griffin Nooms, and Barbarian. And then one match out of 4 had a overall match accuracy above 90%, and that was William Bibiani up against David Del Rio. But oh my goodness, do things change here. We are now into the semifinals, and just looking at these numbers already, you can see a big difference. Round 1, 4 points. Round 2, 6 points. Accuracy, 65.6. Potential points earned, 63%. Overall, both of these matches were defensive struggles. None of the performances there in these 2 semifinal matches were particularly dominating. They were just gutting it out, trying to reach the end. So this is where the big change happened. I didn't really have words to describe what happened during these 2 matches when I was talking about them during the season. Round 1 and round 2 were giving competitors trouble. It wasn't just one thing, it was across the board. Competitors were just struggling during these matches. Looking at the singles final match, we saw round 1 come up a little bit, 7 and 6. Round 2 actually went down a little bit, 4 and 5. Match accuracy was 75 and 84.6 for the competitors, Nooms and Barbarian respectively, and then potential points earned, 69.4 and 55.8%. So this match is very interesting because if you look at the accuracy and the numbers, Barbarian actually ended up being ahead of Griffin Nooms most of the match. He was behind a little bit in round 1, but came from behind and got ahead in the round 2 and the betting round. It was the speed round that really hurt him and gave Nooms the advantage going into the championship round that enabled him to come away with the win in that match. But if you look at the idea of the difference is in the numbers, Barbarian had the higher accuracy, but because of the misses in the speed round actually causing negative points, the potential points earned is where Nooms was able to get the advantage and thus the win. So to recap what we saw in the pre-tournament season and into the first 2 rounds of the tournament, we had a perception that there was a big difference in the matches, and in a way there was. However, the average accuracies were about the same, but the change was the perception because there were so many more matches inside of those first 2 rounds of the tournament that were in that mid 75 to 90% range in match accuracy, versus in the pre-tournament season, we saw a ton of matches that were above that 90%, but there were also a almost equal amount in that mid-range as well as below 75%. So it was all perception, even though the average accuracies ended up being about the same. Moving into the quarterfinals, we saw that round 1 was starting to get a little bit tougher, but competitors were being a little more proficient and taking a few more risks and getting a few more points inside of round 2 in order to see a little bit lower accuracy, but potential points earned actually goes up a little bit. And then we get to the semifinals. That is when the ceiling drops out from these competitors. We saw a drastic drop in accuracy round 1, round 2 performances, and we saw a little bit of improvement once we get into the finals, but overall, those last 2 rounds were gut out. drag out fights to get to the end of this tournament that saw a pretty drastic swing between the quarterfinals and the semifinals, but overall a really cool and amazing tournament to watch to end out our season. And that's going to do it for this week's episode, but don't worry, I'm going to be back next week. I'm not sure what I'm going to talk about yet, but this is where you guys can get involved in the comment section because next week is going to be our 50th episode. Thank you all so much who have tuned in every week or throughout the season, have supported this show and the network overall. But please go ahead and leave some comments on things that you might want me to recap on our 50th anniversary show, or if there are just things that you want me to rehash from earlier in this season or something brand new that I haven't talked about yet. Be sure to leave those down in the comments. And before you go, please make sure that you have hit like, you are subscribed to this channel, and that you have that notification bell hit so you're made aware every time we drop new videos on this channel. Be sure to also check out all the other videos on this channel, as well as over on Twitch, the shows we do over there. All the graphics I presented here, they're going to be uploaded to Facebook through the Call to Action podcast page, as well as shared to the Schmodown Facebook page. And they're also going to be shared on Twitter through the Call to Action podcast channel page, as well as I will retweet them through my personal socials. You'll find all that information down in the description of this video. But until next time, for the entire Call to Action podcast crew, I'm your host, Megs. This is After Action Report, signing off.